Hi. In this video, I'm going to talk about collective action games. And in a collective action game, you need to work with other people to accomplish your goal. And generally, everyone is agreed on, that accomplishing the goal is a good thing, but you would rather have other people do the work or other people sacrifice to accomplish the goal. So an example I bet a lot of you are familiar with is you have a group project for school. So imagine there's a group project and you're all going to get the same grade. The teacher's not going to figure out who did what. And you would, you'd want a good grade, but you'd also rather be doing other things and working on the project. So what you'd kind of like to do is have everyone else do the group project, but of course everyone else wants that as well, and that creates a bit of a conflict. Group projects are actually the way most of the business world works. So academia is kind of weird, where we give you individual grades on, individual work. But that for most of you, you're going to have jobs where that's not the case. You'll be in a team, the team does something. There might be a boss of the team, a manager, but essentially the manager is judged on what individuals do. It might be hard for the manager to know who's doing what kind of work. You're all supposed to work together. And whether groups can basically overcome what I'll call the collective action problem often determines whether they'll succeed or not. So the collective action problem is everyone has an incentive to free ride. Everyone has an incentive to get other people to do the work. But when everyone does that, nothing actually gets done. This, by the way, is a reason why doing team sports can look good on your resume, if you're in college. Because a lot of employers are like, okay, you got A's in school, let's say. Well, that means that you can do work on your own, but a lot of our work involves working with other people. Are you capable of doing that? And if you've done some team sports, that's at least a positive signal that maybe you can do that. And keep in mind when interviewing for jobs, part of what they're trying to evaluate is, can she work well with a team? They can't rely on your academic record to figure that one out, so they might be relying on the kind of answers that you give. Now, we face an enormous collective action problem in the world right now with the virus, with COVID-19, that we're, of course, trying to stop it spreading to everywhere. We're trying to stop it spreading, and the actions individuals take affect other people, right? So if I catch the disease, there's a chance I'll infect other people. So the harm of my catching the disease is greater than the harm I personally suffer. And similarly, I might not have it. I hopefully don't have it now, but I might have it and not know it. So that affects whether, of course, I had a cough then. That, of course, could affect my behavior. So as of this video, we are supposed to be wearing masks when we're out with other people, and that because it reduces the chance of you spreading the disease. So wearing a mask slightly reduces the chance that you will get it, but from what I've read, it has a bigger effect on whether you will transmit the virus to other people. Also practicing physical distancing matters a lot. And if we all, the ideal solution to this would be all practice extreme physical distancing. And, then the disease after a month or so would mostly go away, but people aren't going to be doing that. And as people aren't practicing physical distancing and they're not really obeying the rules, that's going to mean more people get it, or we all have to spend a longer amount of time trying to isolate as best we can. So this is an enormous collective action problem. Now, one of the solutions to the collective action problem is monitoring, right? Ideally, you'd like to say, okay, everyone works on a group project, but if that's not going to happen, if you know that some people will be overcome by laziness, you try your best to monitor. And that's one of the possible ways we might get out of this, is where we monitor people. And, if you find out you have the virus, you're kind of forced to stay home. Maybe you have to keep your cell phone with you. I've heard in some places you've got to take a selfie that's where there's a GPS, there's GPS information in the picture so you can verify where you are. We might require people to wear masks when they're outdoors or when they're in certain crowded places. The key here is that self-interest isn't enough to solve a collective action problem, because almost by definition, you don't pay the full cost of your being lazy or you're not going along with the rules. Other people suffer as well, and so you don't have, it's not in your self-interest to take optimal care. And that's, an enormous issue right now. We, of course, try to appeal to public spiritedness, be a good American, be a good human, be a good neighbor, do what your religion tells you to do. We're trying to appeal to beyond self-interest, and that doesn't always work. So we might have to start using the heavy hand of the state, or, maybe this is not a problem we're going to overcome. Maybe, as of this writing, it's not clear what's going to happen. As of this video, it's not clear what's going to happen in the United States. We might get out of it with, deaths under 100,000, but we also might only get out of it when, say, 70% of the population has been infected and we get herd immunity and the deaths are, in the millions. So how we can solve this collective action problem is absolutely critical. Let's talk about some other collective action problems. And one of them, of course, is language, right? We'd like to be able to communicate with other people. It would be better if everyone in the world spoke the same language, but, we don't. And the world has kind of solved this collective, well, not solved, but they've managed this collective action problem by saying basically everybody, at least who's economically ambitious and reasonably well off, should learn English as a first or second language. And this, this isn't a solution that we had to get to, but once English became popular enough, once enough people in the world knew English, then it became in the interests of other people to learn English. And also there was this equilibrium where people who have English as a native language have less of an incentive to learn another language, right? I mean, it's fine to learn another language, but if you're an American and you don't have any, you weren't raised speaking, say, Japanese or Mandarin, you're probably never going to speak either of those languages as well as Japanese business people or Chinese business people that you're likely to interact with, because you really don't have the incentive, right? Or say you want to be a scientist and you're Japanese, you need to learn English. That's just a critical skill. You're an American scientist and, Japanese wouldn't hurt, but it doesn't help nearly as much as, studying statistics or virology or whatever is your specialty. So you have less of an incentive to learn it, and that, of course, increases the incentive of people in Japan to learn English because they know probably if they need to communicate with an American scientist, it's not going to work if they're talking in Japanese. Some other examples, if you notice the keyboard, right? The keyboard has a very weird configuration. The keys aren't in alphabetical order. And that's kind of just something that wasn't really picked with great care. And once that keyboard got established, it was easier just to go with it, because now if you learn how to type on one keyboard, you can type on others as well. So that's kind of a collective action problem of what kind of keyboard do we all use, and then once it got solved, everyone went with that. That's often a case to solve collective action problems in case where you need everyone to coordinate, everyone to do the same thing. You can hit on something that might not be optimal, but once you get there, it's really, really hard to move. So another collective action issue, and this is relevant to well, you'll see why, is with basically with where people of certain sexual orientations live. So if you happen to have a sexual orientation that's relatively rare, say 5% of the population has it, then you're going to give a lot more weight when choosing what city to live in to what percentage of people in that city are people you can date, right? So if, imagine one person who figures, I can date, 48% of the population. Someone else who says, I'm only able to date 1% of the population. Well, if you can only date 1% of the population and you're trying to think where to move, it's a lot more important to make sure that there's a lot of that 1% in the place you're moving. And this gives us the result that we would expect a certain number of cities to have a high proportion of people, who have sexual preferences that are unusual, like lesbians. So imagine there's a city that has a higher than usual proportion of lesbians. That city would become more attractive to lesbians thinking of moving. And then the proportion of lesbians in that city would go up. And that, of course, would make the city more attractive. Meanwhile, lesbians in cities where it's the lower percent of lesbians as the general population would find moving to a city with a lot of lesbians more attractive, and they would move. So it's not surprising that there are some cities where there's a high percentage of lesbians, and that's going to persist. Because the city has a lot of lesbians, it's going to attract a lot because it did in the past. Another another issue about collective action problems is with sexual harassment. So you probably all familiar. This is my cat who's getting in the way of the camera. Here's my cat, which you probably find more interesting than I'm saying. So with the Me Too movement, right, and let's relate to with powerful men. So powerful men were, sexually harassing women, and they could get away with it because any individual woman would say, gee, who is going to believe me? And, maybe that's right. If it's one person's word against another person, you're right. You can't really be sure who to believe. So there was a collective action problem. So let's say there were 10 women who were being sexually harassed by a powerful guy, who have over the last few years. None of them, say, knew each other. So all of them thought, oh my God, if I come forward, no one is going to, they won't believe me. They think maybe I'm telling the truth, but they certainly can't be sure. But of course, if all 10 of these women came forward at the same time, well, boy, if it's 10 women saying it, that makes it a lot more credible. So part of the value of the Me Too movement is that kind of allowed victims to find each other. And once they could find each other, it then became relatively safe for them all to say, hey, look, it's a lot of us, so you should really believe us. That was a big deal, and that obviously changed things. And of course, this also creates appropriate incentives, right? You can imagine now powerful people won't think, well, gee, I can sexually harass people as long, they won't find out about each other. And if one comes up, maybe even two, I can beat it back. Now they'll think, oh no, these people will connect with each other, and then I'll be in serious trouble. So this has probably created incentives to greatly reduce the amount of sexual harassment. Another big collective action issue is with politics. So with politics, right, you want to influence the political process, but generally you alone, unless you're like a billionaire, you don't really have a lot of influence. But if you get with a lot of other people, then you do have a lot more influence. And some groups can manage to influence the political process a lot better than others. And this basically comes down to whether they can solve their collective action problem. So in order to influence politicians, you basically want the politicians to think, if I support your cause, I will gain votes and campaign contributions that I won't get if I don't support your cause. So one example of that are dairy farmers. Dairy farmers are well organized, and they contribute money to politicians, and they vote for politicians, often based on how the politicians view, how the politicians treat the cows and dairy farming in terms of government subsidies. So it's easier for dairy farmers and other groups to overcome their collective action problem because, they have similar values, they live near each other, they have good organizations. Another group that's relatively good at overcoming their collective action problems is gun owners. So you've probably seen surveys saying, most Americans want, greater gun control, but politicians tend to shy away from that. And that is often because gun owners are willing to vote entirely, a lot of them, based on how they're treated, on the issue of guns. So if a lot of politicians know we will gain extra votes if we are, I'll say, pro-Second Amendment, pro-gun rights, then that's going to influence their decision-making. So it doesn't count, right? A regular poll saying, gee, most Americans want greater restrictions on gun ownership. That's not what's going to matter to a politician, because a politician will say, okay, but will I lose the votes of people who are for restricting gun rights if I come out in favor of positions of, say, the National Rifle Organization? And often the answer is no. I imagine, just guessing here, most of you would say, gee, I would rather, I would like to restrict gun rights, but that wouldn't be enough to swing your vote. I have to imagine if, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, assuming they're the nominees, if they switch their positions on gun rights, for most of you, that would play no role in how you vote. That's just not an important enough issue for you. But there are a huge number of voters for whom, if Donald Trump took, Donald Trump came out with basically Joe Biden's position on gun ownership, that Donald Trump would lose a lot of votes. It would politically probably destroy him, even if it would be a position more in line with what most of Americans want. And this is because gun owners are relatively good at organizing, and they tend to vote based on this issue. So if you want to influence the political process, you have to convince politicians that you will be willing to vote and contribute money based on this issue, even if the politician is or isn't with you on everything else. And that can be a very difficult thing to do. Okay, so that's basically it for collective action problems. Oh, sorry, let me talk about a big issue. Sorry, I should have gotten to this before. With network externalities. So network externality is the more people on a network, the greater the benefit of being on that network. So imagine you're the first person to own a telephone. Pretty useless. A few other people have a telephone. It has a little bit of value. But the more people who own telephones, the greater the value of having a telephone. An externality, if you haven't had econ before, it means you're affecting other people with your actions. So a network externality means the more people who join a network, the better that network is for people who are on it. And so it's better if a lot of people have it. So like email, you all have email. I mean, you have to if you're at Smith, but even if you didn't, you'd want email because so many people have email. The more people who have email, the greater the value of email, the more people have phone numbers. Now, Facebook did a really great job. Facebook is worth so much money because they properly managed network externalities. So imagine, Facebook, it only has value if a lot of other people are also on Facebook, right? If no one else there are the video games you want to play. You don't care at all if other people use it. There's food you want to buy. You don't care if other people like the food, so what? But with Facebook, really only has value to you if other people that you know also use it. So then how do you break into this, right? When Facebook was starting out, how could it create a product that people wanted to use if it was only valuable if lots of other people were already using it? And if you know the history of Facebook, what it did is it started out just at Harvard. So it started out really small, and it was valuable to Harvard students to be on it if other Harvard students were, and that was possible to get enough on to get a critical mass. Then Facebook expanded to college students, and they had to get enough college students on, in order for most college students to want to use it because most others were. And, then they eventually made it available to the entire world. Now imagine you want to compete with Facebook. You want a similar social networking site, but currently nobody is using it. What do you do? How can you combat Facebook? Facebook has this enormous network externality advantage where right now they're very big, and if you want to use social networking, you want to be on Facebook or Instagram. I guess they also own. So how do you compete with Facebook? Google tried. They failed, but what they tried to do is very intelligent and certainly showed an understanding of network externalities. So Google tried with Google+. And what they did was they simply gave everyone who has a Google account, which is a lot of us, a Google+ account. So suddenly, you realize that, a lot of people that I know and care about have a Google+ account. So if I post something on my Google+ account, well, my friends will see it. So that was Google's attempt. It didn't work. Google+ died, but it was, it was a decent idea. It was a decent strategy to combat Facebook's huge network externality advantages. Well, thank you for listening to me for this video. Keep safe, keep washing your hands, and goodbye.